And I'd like to obviously also acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Larrakia people, and their elders past and present. I also like to acknowledge the Uluru people here today who will be, I'll be learning a lot from over the next year. I'm very much in kindergarten. I have a long way to go to learn in this area. I also want to thank the Northern Institute for the opportunity to speak. This is the beginning of a project, and it's actually quite useful for me as well to think through what I'm trying to do from my end. This is a process that's going to continue as we talk, but I also need to get my own thoughts clear about what I was thinking in starting off this ball rolling. So that's what I'll be doing today. So it's a beginning of a project, lots of questions, not many answers, and that's as it should be, of course, at this time. There'll be a lot of concern, I think, about what is diplomacy. Does it really apply to Indigenous area? Do we have ambassadors? Do we have foreign ministries? Do we have things that look like that? What are we even using this term for? And if we're anthropologists, we're thinking, hasn't all this been done before? Didn't we used to call this ceremony and custom law and so on? And what's it really got to offer, this whole project? So I want to cover some of those issues today, but from a diplomatic studies point of view. Diplomatic studies is the area that I'm come from. It's the people who study diplomacy and theorise about it, and it's really part of international relations as a discipline, but it's the people who think about these issues. And my own background is more coming from the Pacific Islands, as Michael said. So this is the course we'll be teaching in November in Canberra, and this will be an intensive course taught by Uluru people, Honorary, Makarata, and also people from Torres Strait, some elders from the Torres Strait. And it seems an odd group to bring together, perhaps you think, Torres Strait and Uluru people, but in fact what they both have some very interesting stories around Indigenous diplomacy principles, and I want to explain some of those in this talk. But that's why we're coming together, that's why we're talking about this week, how we prepare for that. And we're not going to do it on the day when we get to Canberra. We're going to have a meeting on March in Canberra to talk about how we're going to go about it. And that'll be bringing together those elders from both places to see what knowledge they feel should be shared, how it should be shared, what it will be. And it'll be facilitated by Tony Bauman, who's an anthropologist who works a lot in the Northern Territory. So that's the process, and I'll come back to that. So let me then go straight to my starting points, the things that have prompted me to think about this as a way of getting you to think perhaps about why it might be relevant to think about Indigenous diplomacy. But this also shows us some of the different directions you can go in this when you start to explore these different things. The first point, I guess, is that sparked this in me in thinking about it was the makarrata idea in the Uluru Statement. There was a lot of publicity about the voice to Parliament and its rejection by the government, but no one mentioned makarrata. It was there as the agreed set of principles of the nations that had come together at Uluru that they wanted to take forward as a process of negotiating and having dialogue through truth-telling, but through a process that would be a way of the basis for reconciliation going forward, that dialogue to occur. Now that immediately made me think, well, what is makarrata? I know nothing about it. And wouldn't my students like to know about it? Shouldn't the government know about it? If we're just rejecting things out of hand, shouldn't we really know what these things are and look at the principles? And I started to look at some people's explanations of it, and they're obviously anthropological explanations of the 19th century that have very different meanings to the meanings of the 1970s when it became associated with treaty, and very different from the way people were talking about it at Gama and so on. So there's lots of good things on YouTube. You can have a look at people, Uluru people talking about what they mean by it, and it's a good starting place for me to get confused. So I was very confused by the end of this, and that was a reason for thinking about us perhaps making that a kind of focal point for this course, to get the students to think about it and to explore it and perhaps even bring in some of the other people from Uluru that had decided to make this the main way forward for Australia's reconciliation. What did they mean by it? So it was trying to get the different meanings straight. So that was a big influence on thinking about the project. The second one was Auntie Trish Ellis. She's a Yuin elder from the southeast coast of New South Wales, and she's a cultural awareness trainer. And we had a retreat at Kealoha, which is our campus on the coast, ANU campus. We had our diplomacy students all assembled, and we asked Auntie Trish to come and tell us about Aboriginal diplomacy. And she talked to my colleague and said, what do you mean by diplomacy? I don't know what that is even. I don't think we have diplomacy. And so she was being quite modest because she came along and gave the most fantastic lecture you could imagine that just bowled everybody over. So it went through things that this room is totally familiar with, but the audience was not. So it was everything to do with message sticks, envoys, song lines, intermarriage, the various forms of movement of Yuin people up into the highlands, the gatherings for different resources, the arrangements, the understandings that each group had about how they should behave in those cross-cultural contexts with different language groups. And for this audience, we were thinking, well, this is a diplomatic system just like the United Nations or multilateralism, or this is a system, a cultural system where people know what to do in between their groups. And she was claiming it stretched way out because of all the different intermarriage. So it's like we're talking about thousands of miles for the Yuin people. So it was a very intriguing idea. So we all came back to Canberra thinking, why aren't we teaching this? Why aren't we talking about this? We actually teach Sumerian diplomacy. We teach ancient Egyptian diplomacy as other systems, but we don't even think about Australia, the oldest system. So let's have a think about that. So that was Auntie Trish's provocative talk that really got us thinking and made it a big change. She probably doesn't realise that yet. I will tell her, but it really was quite this thing. The third one is my own quick reading to try and catch up, having come back to Australia from Fiji with all the different readings that were around, not just Dark Emu, but many of the other, the biggest estate, Bill Gamage and the historians, the new histories, trying to enrich our view of Indigenous history and society and to redress the tunnel vision of the past that was politically motivated to keep us with a very particular view of Aboriginal society that suited political purposes. So this was very eye-opening to read all these books, and this was also, it seemed to me, the idea of trying to think about Indigenous diplomacy was a way of trying to add to that genre of books that was trying to open up space for thinking about other, to acknowledge Indigenous diplomacy as having existed and being rich and valuable, and also continuing to exist in various forms that is rich and valuable. So to put it on the map, if you like, in diplomatic studies, and to make it, but also in Indigenous studies as another area that had been overlooked or underemphasised, or not allocated a word that gives it status, what was being seen. And the last part was with my own background in Oceania, in Melanesia, Polynesia and Micronesia. I've been working there for about 40 years, and the last 5 years I spent at Fiji in the university there, and I was teaching diplomacy. And my students all thought that diplomacy was a Western thing that was all associated with the United Nations, foreign ministries, embassies and ambassadors. And I got them to do a project on their own diplomacy. And they all came up with the same ideas about how it operated today, right now, in Fiji between villages. And so there's conflict between two villages, and they have each have a mata ni vanua, who represents the vanua, the extended clan, and those people go out and have negotiations with appropriate kava ceremonies and all of that around it to have a legitimate dialogue, and the solution is accepted by everybody because everyone knows how that culture works. That way of negotiating between groups. And of course it was happening right across the Pacific. After the Bougainville War, the reconciliation between all the people, warring families that killed each other, were doing everything through traditional reconciliation. Right across Solomon Islands in relation to the Solomons conflict. We saw it in so many areas. So it's a very important example to me. So I started a project there with my students, and they're now starting to write up some of that research to look at different ways that diplomacy is used in the Pacific today. So when you think about it, they've only been there 3,000 years, but 3,000 years is a long time to develop all these very entrenched cultural systems that mean that it's possible for people to resolve conflict and deal with each other as different villages and clans, but without having to resort to the state, because they don't accept the state as a legitimate actor in these situations. Now the Makarata I just wanted to briefly remind you of what was in the Uluru Statement there, as that's for the Makarata point I made, just to make the point that this was rejected. It wasn't even rejected by the government, it was never acknowledged as having been put forward, whereas the voice to Parliament was rejected explicitly, but this wasn't. It wasn't even acknowledged to have existed as a recommendation, and yet it seemed to be such an important set of ideas that needed exploration in the contemporary context. There were some of those books I was telling you about that influenced me in terms of getting different perspectives on first encounters, looking at it from the Indigenous point of view, around a cultural system, of the expectations they took for those first encounters that were misinterpreted by Europeans, those sorts of things. Or it was just such a different interest. And this is the area I've been working on in the Pacific, Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia. We're having a workshop in April with the Pacific Islanders from each of those areas to talk about Indigenous diplomacy in Oceania. Now I just want to take you briefly through one dispute resolution that I found really interesting that might interest you in terms of your thinking about diplomacy. In New Caledonia, there still is a sovereignty movement, a movement for independence, for self-determination. And the leader of that movement, Jean-Marie Tjibaou, was killed by another leader of the movement. He was shot because he felt that the other guy had sold out to the French government. So there was a disagreement over how they should negotiate independence. And the person who did the killing was immediately killed at that point by someone else. So there was tremendous tension and sadness between these two groups. And it carried on for many, many years, over a decade. And the widow of the man that was killed, Marie Claude, is a very prominent Indigenous person in New Caledonia. She wanted to have a reconciliation with that group. But the group that she came from was Melanesian, different language group, and they never had any traditional contact with this other group on an island, Polynesians. So here were two people with their own cultures, own ways of reconciling within their cultures, but in this situation they had no way of working out what to do. So she spent 18 months working out with the other guy's widow what is an appropriate culture, a reconciliation culture that we can both agree on as having Indigenous principles, but will satisfy us both. Not just one side's culture, but a new culture. An area that we can go into that space and we both accept that when we've finished that reconciliation, we feel like we've been reconciled. And in fact, it was incredibly successful. It was filmed, the whole thing, over the 18 months, and it's become a kind of example to other parts of the world. People show it in Palestine and all sorts of places now. But it's this knowledge is well known. It's not intruding on their space, but this is the group that of the person that killed the person, and they're coming to ask forgiveness, and they're bringing mats and food and so on. And obviously this person is speaking on behalf of the group, and food and other gifts are brought. And then there is a reconciliation between these two women who are now see each other as sisters, and they become a very big example of that reconciliation. But I make this point here to say that was for me, a very influential action, because it showed the effort put into making a culture like that and trying to create a diplomatic system, a diplomacy culture in between cultures that could resolve a conflict, and that it takes a lot of effort to do that. You just can't assume that you can walk in and shake hands. So that was the idea there. So this suggested to me possible directions for this project, these sources. So all these different things I talked about, but reading those various books, listening to Auntie Tricia, talking to looking at the Makarata and so on. It seemed to be three main things to think about which might interest our lecturers who are going to be thinking about this. One was, is the project about establishing the existence and nature of traditional Indigenous diplomacy? In other words, to tell people, like Dark Emu was telling people that agriculture existed, just to give it status, to recognise, to acknowledge this, that there were systems, knowledge systems around agriculture or astronomy, whatever else we like to think about, to enrich our knowledge of the Indigenous society. So is that the task? It's more an historical task, and it can be done. So I had those sort of questions. So was it that sort of project? Trying to look at all the different claims that are made around, building on songlines, building on those trade networks. What are the systems around that, and what did they look like? How big were they? What were they, do they stretch right across Australia? How do they intersect? Which language did people use when they were talking to each other in these contexts? So an historical, anthropological investigation in a way, using Indigenous knowledge now, oral history, as well as things that were written down but not appreciated as diplomatic studies. Second one is the contemporary applications in dispute resolution between tribes, clans or outside groups such as mining. So in the way of what we talked about in New Caledonia with that dispute resolution, having to create new systems but based on Indigenous principles, to what extent is it about that? Really looking at how things operate today and Indigenous, using those diplomatic principles about dialogue, about that culture in between. And then thirdly, the whole reconciliation itself, given its importance for Australia and the centrality of this Makarata idea being put forward, was there a role here for people to really explore that and focus on that, and for the students to think about that, and for the teachers to think about that, the contradictions, the complexities of thinking about this as the way forward for Australia. So it's carrying a lot of weight at the moment, this word, and so we want to try and explore that. So that was another sort of emphasis. Now all of those had problems associated with them that you will tell me about, but they were sort of seemed to me the sort of clusters of ideas or directions I was thinking about. So one of the things you're probably really trying to work out is what I mean by diplomacy, and I think I've hinted at it already. I'm giving you a cultural idea of diplomacy. Diplomacy as a culture. I'm not talking about when someone goes to the United Nations, makes a treaty, or comes out of the foreign ministry in their suit and goes off and represents their country and has a dialogue with someone. It's much broader than that. Diplomacy is the culture that surrounds that. When that person goes off in their suit to the United Nations, they know what they're entering. It's a cultural system, a system where only they can go as representatives of their countries and sit around, and they know they can sit in alphabetical order around the table, and it's not the most powerful state that gets supremacy, as it used to be in the earlier cultures of the global level. So in a sense we have a culture there as well at the global level that gets changed every now and then depending on the great power of the time. So you get an American system, a French system, and earlier systems around the church and so on in Europe. But over time we've had different cultures at the global level. And what I'm saying to you is that's a very useful way of thinking about diplomacy, that it's not just about individual people doing negotiations or having dialogue or solving disputes. It's about the fact that those people go into a room with a cultural context in mind. They know when they can speak, who has a right to speak, what was regarded as a way to resolve it, make a decision, what rituals occur to make sure that everyone believes in what happens. See, even I was going to all these meetings in the South Pacific of leaders, and you realise after a while that they were just doing the same as people at the village level. The village level, in the kava ceremony, you're always handing out the kava to establish the hierarchy of people in the Samoan village. So you're each time you're calling out the titles, you're saying it's this person first, this person second, this person third, and so on. At the United Nations, they're trying to establish, and at the regional institutions that I used to attend, they're trying to establish equality. So when you go into the room, we all know we're equal as we talk. So what they do the whole first day is just have everybody turn up with their car and raise the flag, sing the national anthem for every single country. So China is the same as Niue. little Niue with 4,000 people. Everyone has the song, they have the flag, and they're welcomed as equally by the head of state. So these are diplomatic rituals, cultural rituals of today that are at the global level, and they're no different to what's really happening at a local level, where people have set up cultures and rituals, things that make us believe that this is the right thing and that this is the right practice. We know what to do when we get into this space. So that's how I'm using diplomacy in that broader sense. So initially we think of it more as state-centric and Western-centric, but we have to open it up and look at more the fact that what we're really dealing with is relationships between sovereign entities. Now, sovereign's a bit of a tricky word when we talk about Indigenous politics, not only because of the demand for sovereignty, obviously for Indigenous people in relation to the Australian state, but also because of the difficulty of the question of whether different groups in Indigenous society are sovereign from each other. I've been assuming that they are, but in fact, the more I read, the more I realise everyone's interrelated and there's so many different kinship links that you realise that it's much more linked across these groups. So they're not just, the assumption underpinning diplomacy is there are separate, you need separate groups that see each other as sovereign, that other group has a right to that place and you have a right to this place, and every now and again we have to do business together, so what's the culture we developed in between us to work that out? So the key point is the sovereignty aspect. So it might be groups that recognise each other as being sovereign, might be just two different families, for example, that see each other as they have sovereignty in their space to work out how they're going to work their family, and they recognise our right to that. But every now and again we've got to negotiate something because we disapprove of something they're doing that's hurting the common space. So that's the underpinning this view of the conventional wisdom is this idea that it really, in the end, it's about sovereign groups. They don't have to be equally powerful groups, but they have to regard each other as having sovereignty over their groups. So what I'm arguing right through this is that if we see diplomacy as the culture in between other cultures, so the culture that is associated with a particular place, another culture in another place, they've got to build a culture in between over time. It's probably easier to see in terms of the Yulngu-Macassan relationship. They had to build a diplomatic culture in between them, and they developed a language, as I understand it, to operate that culture, that diplomatic culture, and various understandings had to be negotiated and worked out that would suit both sides. What actually happened in the middle wasn't Yulngu culture and it wasn't Macassan culture, it was something else, a third culture in between. So that's the idea. So just as in the case of New Caledonia, it wasn't the person who killed that guy that their people, they had their culture, and Marie Claude had their culture, and they had to make a new culture to have the reconciliation ceremony in between. And it's important that it's a culture that changes. It's not one that is static forever. It's not a traditional idea that stays forever the same. So, but there are principles, I think, that carry through often that people accept, or rituals that people accept as legitimating situations, so that they are fluid. And there's new contexts. The whole point about the world is it's moved on. We've got mining coming in, we've got Christianity, we've got all the different changes, people movement, and everyone's got to operate in different contexts to resolve conflict or to do things. So they've got to create much more complex interactions with other groups. It's very hard to do this in a modern context, but that's what happens right across the Pacific Islands that I've been watching. That recreation of these new contexts so that people can resolve conflict. So it's a lot of work to do that, but it needs to be done if there's going to be legitimate outcomes. So for Indigenous diplomacy, then I'm talking about the encounter culture between clans, tribes, nations. So that and I know it's complicated. We can talk about that later today when we talk about the complications. I'm starting to learn that it's not as simple as that. But it's generally seen as that encounter culture between clans, but a culture in between. So let's call it that. Encounter might sound a bit strong, but it's where one group's encountering another group that's not of their immediate language or group. So it's a set of agreed principles about how to behave, about who speaks, about what rituals are performed, how messengers are to be treated, how dialogue is conducted, things like that. And it includes newly made diplomatic cultures for new contexts, but observing Indigenous diplomacy principles. So an example would be the Makarata principles, here as put forward by Uluru Statement, and where he tries to explain what's in the Uluru Statement. And so he's saying this is not the same as 19th century Makarata, but the principles are there. The key principles he sees it going forward. Now you might disagree with those principles, and that's fine, because I think that's really important in terms of the discussion we have in our teaching course, where people have different views about what those principles are. I'll let you just read that for a minute to see whether you agree with that. So to me, as a diplomatic studies person, I kind of recognise that as a diplomatic culture. He's saying who should be there, how they should act, what should be regarded as an outcome, and what legitimates it. It's a process. It's a diplomatic process. It's a diplomatic culture, but a process is also suggested within that culture. A set of behaviours that, from their point of view, would create good dialogue and a way forward for reconciliation. Now, we know what the Australian government thought of that. They didn't even recognise that it had been put forward. So it's a long way to go to educate them on this one. But that's a culture. So just let me quickly go through these questions. Why is there a lack of acknowledgement? Why is it important to acknowledge the existence and value of this social institution? And what knowledge pathways could lead to greater acknowledgement? So the lack of acknowledgement in my area, diplomatic studies, I think you already see is because of the people think state-centric, and they think about Western-centric ideas. They don't think of Indigenous areas as being a place for diplomacy. So it's only recently we've had people talking about Indigenous diplomacy elsewhere in the world. There's studies of North American Indian tribes and how they related, African empires, there's work on various Maori interactions and so on. So diplomatic studies itself can't see Indigenous diplomacy easily because they can't see ambassadors, they can't see United Nations, they can't see the states. So that the same scepticism that was there for Indigenous governance is there for Indigenous diplomacy. So people aren't seeing things that they're used to. They can't see what's there until you open up what the principles are. Anthropology, I'm really going out on a limb here to offend the anthropologists in the room, but I think my very superficial reading of the anthropology in this area tends to be that people tend to be more tribal-centric or language-centric, so they don't necessarily put most of their emphasis on looking at the culture in between. Their work is coming out of the effort they've put in to learn a language or to really know a place or people, and not necessarily to know these other trading cultures or cultures around people movement and so on. But there are big exceptions, which I'll come to later. And then history. Histories of very Eurocentric interpretations of encounters that might be otherwise called diplomatic encounters. When people first tried to find out what each side was thinking, people were misinterpreting a lot of Indigenous activity or not realising that they couldn't see the culture that was there, the diplomatic culture that was there, because of those Eurocentric interpretations. And of course it's part of a more general political denial. It's tied in, because diplomacy is so much tied in, if you acknowledge diplomacy, you're acknowledging sovereignty, you're acknowledging sophisticated social systems, you're acknowledging systems that go right across the land, knowledge systems that are well spread and people accepting them across big areas, and successful governance intertribal governments right across the country. So you're starting to get into the territory of very political territory. So that's another major reason why there's been a denial of diplomacy, I think. So why is it important? Well, it follows obviously that respect alone is important in filling out the real history and also the impact on self-respect. The people, when I talk to Indigenous young ambassadors in the Department of Foreign Affairs, they said, oh, we would love if our white colleagues could listen to this, if they could come to this course and learn that we actually had diplomacy too, So there's a kind of a self-respect there of feeling, yeah, okay, we get acknowledged for the fact that these things really exist here too. It's not just about you guys coming in and making it happen. It doesn't begin with just white history. And then there's the question, the second one there is the acknowledgement of the value of these principles in contemporary contexts of creating these in contemporary dispute resolution and so on within Indigenous world of Australia, and then assisting us with the understanding Indigenous diplomacy principles like Makarata in relation to the reconciliation. And for diplomatic studies, for us, it makes us rethink diplomacy itself, because it's such a more complex system where you have sovereign entities but people who are related. So there's this, and some shared cosmologies as well. So you've got a connection in Indigenous society as well as sovereign groups. So it's a very different assumption to what the mainstream diplomatic studies is about. So it has its own interest there. And what knowledge pathways should we take into this? What's there? What are the openings for thinking about research and teaching in this area? I think first of all in diplomatic studies, this new Indigenous diplomacy area is interesting, and particularly the work by Ravi Da Costa, who's the only person who's written anything on Indigenous diplomacy in Australia. He wrote one chapter in Indigenous diplomacy's book. This is the only edited book on Indigenous diplomacies generally worldwide, and only one chapter there is dealing with diplomacies before European occupation. That's Ravi Da Costa's. But most of them are dealing with Indigenous people working in the United Nations, Indigenous people working to get treaties and global alliances and that sort of thing. So it's more Indigenous people working in conventional diplomacy rather than something different in Indigenous diplomacy. But Ravi Da Costa things are very interesting because he's really talking about this, the importance of this idea of connection at the same time as sovereignty. And it particularly relating, he makes some big claims that would be great to talk to people here about and understand whether his claims are right. But he makes big claims about these networks. For example, that cosmology was shared across groups in big areas of Australia, Southeast Australia, Arnhem Land and elsewhere. The belief systems in gods or founding things or dreamtime and so on were very shared ideas, and that this created shared values at a larger, when people came together to do diplomacy, in a sense there was this background of shared cosmology. So he makes this argument, plus the mobility and kinship movement, of course, and the networks of exchange. But he also takes us to, and he builds all this on existing anthropological works. So there's it's really a treasure trove for people trying to do research in this area and then maybe take a different view to his or not, but to sort of see where he's been. He shows you where he's been, so he's tracking down all the different anthropologists who talked about the 19th century. So it's really based in the 19th century. And then he brings in the innovation of the Macassans, and the Uluru there is a kind of another example of innovation and change as well, and looking at that system. So that's really the most exciting piece of an opening there to think about further about Indigenous diplomacy, coming out of diplomacy. Anthropology, there's any number of works that he refers to that are useful there. Almost the whole of anthropology is useful in some way or other in this area. I mean, it's very hard to get specific things on the intertribal. There's some old works, like this 1910 work, that are very interesting. Often it's just things in passing, where people are talking about ceremonies that seem to be of that place, but have a broader, like a makarrata, but actually it's also used in intertribal relations. but generally speaking, there's not a lot of study of this area that I could find explicitly. This is one way that word diplomacy is used, and that's a very interesting book indeed. And that's bringing together knowledge about ritual of diplomacy. So that was a very interesting read for me. And where am I? I'll come back to Indigenous knowledge, which is where contemporary knowledge holders will be crucial, and who are going to be people we talk with and who are going to actually lead the project. So we'll come back to that. So some possible directions to me. I've gone back to, this is where I started at the beginning. I just want to talk about, in conclusion, what these each might look like. So establishing historic diplomacy in that idea of acknowledging that diplomacy existed and was rich, akin to Bruce Cassow's establishment of the idea of agriculture as a knowledge system. Obviously offensive to people that know that they've already always had it, or to others that are fully aware of this, but there's a kind of it's very hard to really get things recognised in the social sciences, and so it's really a political move. But that idea of trying to really expand, I suppose, Ravi DaCosta's work to show the extent of these diplomatic systems across Australia would be interesting in itself. So this is one sort of line the project could take. And those are the sort of questions you could ask. How many systems, who belong, how universal, what relationship to absence of organised warfare, which is another interesting thing for a lot of people. That I know it's controversial, but the idea of lack of major warfare in Australia for so long, it does seem to raise questions about diplomacy. All the work that's been done on these transcontinental song lines and exchange systems and so on does suggest a whole set of questions around the rules and conventions and cultures that were around that for people moving, and that they'll be likely to be out there in various accounts, and as well as with Indigenous knowledge, but they need to be brought together if you're following this line. So there are questions about how these cultures in between work, who are the actors, what variations, who can speak, what language is spoken in these situations. The role of women, what rituals legitimate the dialogue, lots of different questions to ask about these. The second one is contemporary adaptations. So looking at, not at a idealised past, but more what's actually happening today in terms of principles that we could call Indigenous principles that are being used for contemporary contexts, and how do they work in these. So it's really case studies and knowledge of elders around things that really work today. And if we're taking the Makarata idea, to what extent is that used in contemporary contexts by Uluru? How is it adapted? What legitimacy is accorded to them? What makes it a success? And the third one was the Makarata principles and reconciliation. Given this has been the main diplomatic concept put forward in the reconciliation debate as a way going forward, what does it really mean? How do we go beyond what we've been told about those principles, and how would it work, and what? So it's learning more about it, really, I suppose. But also keeping the contradictions alive. The idea that there's different views about all this. There's not just one answer to these things. So thinking about these, the process is very much Indigenous-led, and we're starting in March. We're starting now, actually, this afternoon to talk, to listen. And in March, people coming to Canberra to talk about what people would like to see in the course we teach in November. And then in November, there'll be Uluru elders and Torres Strait elders there, as well as Michaela and Rory, to teach that course. And that'll be to the master's students in diplomacy in Canberra. And so the process at this point will be very, it's really geared to the teaching. What is to be taught? How do we do it? Do we make it more about the Makarata? Do it as a focal point? Do we talk much more about and the contradictions? people's ideas, different ideas about what that is, and how does it work in contemporary context, how does it work in past context, what's it really mean in reconciliation, or do we talk about historical systems that people know about, or do we talk about other case studies for the Makarata today in other dispute resolutions, other things that were used between groups. When we get to Canberra in March and November, we'll be working with the Torres Strait people, who will also be an interesting contrast, because they come out of a war system. The Torres Strait was a warlike people. People took heads and so on, and then they became a peace system under the Christians, but then they had extended diplomacy systems right through the Torres Strait, going into Papua New Guinea, of course, and into Aboriginal Australia. But in the contemporary context, they're using diplomatic principles to negotiate across the border. So it's really fascinating. So the person who actually is in charge of that will be talking with the other cultural elders about that context of using old diplomatic principles accepted by the Papua New Guineans and by their villages and by the Torres Strait villages, and how they can use those ideas in contemporary context in a way you couldn't use modern law or reconciliation or consultation. This is really something that people find legitimate behaviour, and she's going to explain all that. So I think the conversation between the two will be very interesting. And I look forward to that conversation continuing. Thank you.